Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Ashtottara Shata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Ashtottara Shata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai Prem Shikaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Krishna Kop Gopinath Shamakund Radhakund Giri Govardhana Ki Jai Shri Vrindavan Dhama Ki Jai Shri Mayapur Navadvip Dhama Ki Jai Shri Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai Nitai Gaura Premanande. All glories to the assembly devotees. All glories to the assembly devotees. All glories to the assembly devotees. All glories to the lotus feet of Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naran Shaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasan Tato Jayamudiraye Nasu Praya Surabhadresu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya Cha Nanda Gopa Kumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha. Reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 7, Text 42, chapter entitled Scheduled Incarnations. Nantam vidam ya aham ami munau grijaste. Maya balasya puranasya kutavaraye. Gayan guna dasa shantana adideva. Se so dunapi samavasyati nasya param. Nantam vidam ya aham ami muna grigraste. There's no shloka up there. Maya balyasya puranasya kutavaraye. Gayan guna dasa shatana adideva. Se so dunapi samavasyati nasya param. Nantam vidam yaham ami munayo grajaste. Maya balasya puranasya kutavaraye. Gayan Guna Dasha Shatana Adideva Seso Dunapi Samavasyati Nasya Param. Yograjaste Maya Balasya Purusasya Kutavaraye Yanunana Dashatana Anadideva. So, looks like there's nothing on the board. So, yeah. Okay. So I'll just go ahead. Na, never. Antam, end. Idami, do I know. Aham, myself. Ami, and all those. Munaya, great sages. Agraga, born prior to. Te, you. Maya Balasya, of the omnipotent. Purusaya, of the personality of Godhead. Kuta, what to speak of others. Avara, born after us. Yea, those. Gayan, by singing. Guna, the qualities. Dasha Shantana, one who has 1,000 faces. Adideva, the first incarnation of the Lord. Sesha, known as Sesha. Aduna, until now. Api, even. Samavasyati, can achieve. Na, not. Asya, of him. Param, limit. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation: neither I nor all the sages born before you know fully the omnipotent personality of Godhead. So what can others who are born after us know about him? Even the first incarnation of the Lord, namely Sesha, has not been able to reach the limit of such knowledge, although he is describing the qualities of the Lord with 1,000 faces. Purport: the omnipotent personality of Godhead is primarily three potential manifestations, namely internal, external, and marginal potencies, with unlimited expansions of these three energies. As such, the potential expansions can never be calculated by anyone, because even the personality of God in himself, as the incarnation of Shesha, cannot estimate the potencies, although he has been describing them continuously with 1,000 faces. With his 1,000 faces, with a capital H. Om Agyanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakoya Chakshurun Minitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manovistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swam Padantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yukta Parakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sagana Raghunath Vitam Samsajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesva Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhanu Sude Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavarannaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namane Gortase Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschatchareshatarine Vanshakaupatarumvisya Kripa Sindhuve Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Makun Korati Vachalam Pangolin Hegirim Targipataram Bande Shigurum Dinatainam Vagisha Yashavarane Lakshmi Yasha Chavakshashi Yashiste Hridaye Samvitam Nishimham Maham Vaje. When I read this purport, I thought of that pastime with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, where a newspaper reporter came and asked him, how do you find so much subject matter to speak about in your Harmonist magazine? Because they were producing at that time, the Gaudiya Math was producing a magazine every day, or a newspaper every day, and they always had fresh material coming out off the press. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said, even in like the mundane world, there's a newspaper every day, but that's a finite, limited world. Whereas the spiritual world, there's ever increasing fresh topics. So actually, we're not producing enough. We're not producing enough Krishna Katha. So I was thinking of that in relationship to Anantashesh, which is befitting because Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati is the spiritual master of Srila Prabhupada, who is our society's Param Guru. And Anantashesh is none other than Lord Nityananda. And Lord Nityananda is Adidev. So Adi Guru, in manifesting himself as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, is saying that there's an unlimited number of topics that can be spoken about the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is manifested in the form of the harmonist, of all the literature that the Gaudiya Math was putting out. And then coming down to the line of disciplic succession, we see Srila Prabhupada producing so many books in the short period of time that he's able to produce. Not only his books, but Back to Godhead magazine. And his small books, plus all the lectures that he gave. Right now I'm making an attempt to listen to all of Prabhupada's classes chronologically. And as you go through it, it's everything that you're hearing in Prabhupada's books. But the way he's presenting it is very poignant in the sense that it's the same topics that are in the book, but the way it's presented is presented in such a way that you can kind of understand how you yourself would be able to present it in a circumstance. And Prabhupada presents it in very simple terms, although the subject matter of Krishna consciousness is extremely subtle, and in one sense not really suitable for the English language. But Srila Prabhupada is making it available through the English language. So we're beginning to hear just a fragment of the glories of the Lord that are coming from the mouth of Ananta Sesh to the mouth of the Guru Parampara. And this is our good fortune. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada, he talks about how Krishna expands himself into three principal energies, which in the Nectar of Instruction is explained as Bahiranga Shakti, Tatastha Shakti, and Antaranga Shakti. The Bahiranga Shakti is the external potency of the Lord. And Srila Prabhupada explains in his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita that it is Prakriti, but the difference between this particular Prakriti and the living entity Prakriti is that the Bahiranga Shakti is unconscious, whereas the living entity, who is the Tatastha Shakti, he is of a conscious energy, as well as the Antaranga Shakti. So the marginal energy and the internal energy are both conscious energy, whereas the external energy is unconscious energy. And the marginal energy is situated between the external and internal energy. That's why it's called marginal, just like the ocean. You know, you have the beach, and sometimes the tide, it rises and it covers a part of the beach, and then it settles back, and then it's not covered by the beach. So the land is like one energy and the ocean is like another energy. And sometimes the living entity becomes covered over and sometimes he's not covered over. So because we can understand that sometimes the living entity is covered and sometimes he's not covered, we can understand that there's two categories of living entities that are existing within the marginal potency. And this is explained by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, that there are living entities who are Bahirmukh Janas. And then he explains that there are living entities that are Antarmukh Janas. The Bahirmukh Jana is what it sounds like. He is situated externally. And being absorbed in the external energy, he's absorbed in an understanding that I am this material body. It's explained, Mama Ishvam So Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. Manasastra Indriyani Prakriti Stani Karsati. And so the living entity identified with the material body, struggling with the false ego, is not only struggling with the false ego, but simultaneously with the mind and the senses. And this struggle with the mind and the senses is causing him to suffer the repetition of birth and death. Janma Mritu Jaravadi, that he's suffering the repetition of birth and death, old age and disease. And due to him having to go through this cycle, he is experiencing the nature of the material energy, which Krishna himself describes in the Bhagavad Gita as being Dukailam Ashashvatam. And this state of the living entity, the state of the Tatastha Shakti being situated as a Bahirmukh Jana, is described consistently in Srila Prabhupada's books as being a conditional state. So I went to go look up the word conditional because we read this frequently in Prabhupada's books, but it's really interesting for me to kind of study the history of a word and simultaneously the words that are related to that word that carry the same meaning. So the definition of conditional, or rather the adjective of conditional, is restrictive. So the Bahirmukh Jana, he's existing in a restrictive, constricted consciousness. His consciousness is constricted by the pullings of his mind and senses. This is explained by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, Yehi samsparsa jaboka dukayonaya evati, that when the living entity who possesses material senses and a material mind interacts with the sense objects, this contact of the senses meeting the sense objects for the purpose of enjoyment, the result of it is dukkha yonaya. It is the womb of misery. So the living entity, due to identifying with the material body and considering himself to the material body to be the all in all, acts on the basis of that knowledge. I often tell people when I'm, I have these reading phone calls that I do with people that I've met on books. And I often tell people that material life is impulse precedes action, whereas spiritual life is knowledge precedes action. Impulse precedes action is material life, and knowledge precedes action is spiritual life. So that's how we can classify the second class of living entity, the antarmukjana. They're acting according to who they actually are. They're acting according to the understanding Jiver Swarup Hoy Krishna Nityadas, that I'm an eternal servant of Krishna. And they are, as explained in the Bhagavad Gita, Mahatmanas tumam partha devim prakritimashata. They are guided by a different kind of energy. Whereas the Bahirmukjanas are being guided by the Mahamaya, the Antarmukjanas are being guided by the Yogamaya. In other words, the living entity constantly has to be dictated. He constantly has to be under control. The very definition of the living entity is that he has to be dictated by some superior cause. And whether one chooses to be dictated by Krishna directly or by Krishna's material energy, one has to take shelter of something or someone. So it's explained in the Bhagavad Gita that the Mahatmas, they're taking shelter of a superior energy. And that superior energy is Yogamaya. And that Yogamaya guides the living entity in order to facilitate the natural function of the living entity. And this is known as the constitutional position. So just like I did with the condition where it meant restrictive, the constitutional, its adjective is actually inherent or innate. It's an innate tendency of the living entity. So what we can understand from the Bhagavad Gita is that the inherent nature of the living entity is to be guided by this divine energy. But due to a misconception of who they are being guided by a different kind of energy. So if we understand that the inherent nature of the living entity is to be guided by the superior energy, then we can begin to contemplate what is the activity of that living entity who is existing within the superior energy. And that's explained in the Bhagavad Gita just after the verse Mahatmanas tumam partha. It's explained, Satatam kirtayantomam yatantascha dhridavrata namasyantas chamam bhaktya nitya yukta upasyate. That those living entities who are existing in a constitutional, intrinsic nature, who are acting naturally, their natural function is to constantly hear and glorify Krishna. And you'll find that even the conditioned living entity, he can't get away from hearing and chanting about Krishna. The difference is he's hearing and chanting about Krishna's potencies within the unconscious external energy of the Lord. So the living entity can't get away from the propensity to hear and chant. But in a artificial condition, that hearing and chanting is bringing about his bondage, whereas when one is situated in knowledge, that hearing and chanting is bringing about his joy and his liberation. Or if one's in a liberated state, it's deepening his attachment to Krishna. An attachment that's already there, but we can understand the nature of the spiritual world is that love just continues to expand and expand and expand. So how does a living entity go from being a Bahirmukjana to an Antarmukjana? It's explained that the process is through hearing Srimad Bhagavatam. And we should understand that the chapter that we've just studied, which is coming to a close very soon, it's not interested, or the whole Srimad Bhagavatam for that matter, is not interested in just presenting some interesting information for the world. The purpose of the Srimad Bhagavatam is it's trying to bring about a meaningful transformation of the heart of the living entity. And in order to actually take shelter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and in order for us to actually experience the change of heart that the Srimad Bhagavatam is trying to offer us, we have to engage in a process of sadhana that allows us to come to the stage of understanding Srimad Bhagavatam in its totality. Because the Srimad Bhagavatam, as it describes as Dharma prochita kaiva votra paramo nirmatsaramam satam. It is kicking out all forms of cheating religion, establishing the truth of Shuddha Bhakti, pure devotional service, and it's meant for those people who are nirmatsaranam, those who are completely free from any propensity to criticize others, to be envious of other people. So in order for us to actually take shelter of the Srimad Bhagavatam and really begin to relish nigamakalpataru galitam phalam sukamakam amrita dravasamyutam pipada bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasikabu vibavu kaha. It's explaining that the Srimad Bhagavatam is actually the ripened fruit of the Srimad Bhagavatam. The Srimad Bhagavatam is the ripened fruit of the Vedic wisdom tree. And this knowledge is actually becoming sweeter by the touch of Shuka Goswami. And why is it becoming sweeter? Because it's giving the pure mellows of Krishna Prema. It's full of those exchanges between Shuddha Bhaktas and Bhagavan. It's full of descriptions of Bhakti, and Bhagavan. And so in order for us to fully appreciate it, we have to enter into the consciousness in which it's situated on. Not that we can't appreciate it at the current status that we're at, but in order for us to really go deeply within the waves of Srimad Bhagavatam, one has to apply a process of sadhana that brings one to the same standard that the Srimad Bhagavatam is existing on. And that sadhana is described by Rupa Goswami as that which brings about Bhava Bhakti. And this Bhava Bhakti, and the sadhana that brings about this Bhava Bhakti, is being given by Lord Nityananda in the marketplace of the holy name, where he is singing Bhaja Gauranga, Kaha Gauranga, Laha Gauranga Namare, Jai Jana Gauranga Bhaje, Se Hoy Amara Prana Re. That talk about Gauranga, worship Gauranga, make Gauranga your life and soul, and this will bring me so much joy. So Lord Nitai is telling us, take shelter of Lord Chaitanya and worship Lord Chaitanya. Because by doing this, Lord Chaitanya will give you the gift that he's giving to the world. When Lord Chaitanya came to this world, he gave everyone the fruit of love of God. So in order for us to taste that fruit of love of God, we have to worship Lord Chaitanya in the way that Lord Nityananda is advising us to do. And therefore, in order for us to take shelter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, we have to worship Lord Chaitanya because Lord Chaitanya is giving Krishna Prema. And Srimad Bhagavatam is meant for those who have Krishna Prema. So if we want to take shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam but not take shelter of Lord Chaitanya, we're missing the point. Because in order for us to actually take shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam, we have to take shelter of Lord Chaitanya. And taking shelter of Lord Chaitanya is described by Lord Nityananda. How does one actually take shelter of Lord Chaitanya? How does actually one worship Lord Chaitanya? Bolo Krishna, Bhajo Krishna, Koro Krishna Shiksha. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur is saying, Jivadoy Krishnanam Saradharma Sa. Right? Yeah. He's saying that this process of Jivadoy and Krishnanam, this showing compassion to living entities, giving the holy name to the living entities, tasting the holy name oneself, teaching the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, teaching the instructions of Srimad Bhagavatam. This is the topmost of all religious principles. And by worshiping Lord Chaitanya, one actually wins the heart of Lord Nityananda. And what happens when one worships Lord Nityananda? When one worships Lord Nityananda, it is said, Samsara Basana Mora Kabe Tucha Habe, that one's mind becomes freed from material desires. And when one's mind becomes freed from material desires, one can become situated in their natural position as a servant of Krishna. They will no longer be pulled by the external energy. Rather, they'll be completely situated in the internal energy of the Lord. And in this consciousness, with mind freed from material desires, mind freed from any type of material inclinations, not being pulled by the vrittis and samskars of our long association with the material energy, one can begin to take shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam. And by taking shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam, one comes in contact with devotees like Uddhava. One comes in contact with devotees like Bhishmadev. One comes in contact with devotees like Dhruva Maharaj, Prahlad Maharaj, Ambarish Maharaj, these great saints, these great personalities who are existing in the topmost levels of devotional service. And by hearing about those pastimes, we become attracted to their standard of devotion. And we begin to feel, when will that day come when I can serve like them? When will that day come when I will develop a similar service attitude of them? And when will that day come when I can actually speak about the Srimad Bhagavatam, speak about Krishna with genuine love and devotion? And then all the activities that we're doing, the whole process that Srila Prabhupada has given us, it's a perfect process. The only thing that changes is our consciousness. Every morning we're worshiping the deities, we're worshiping the spiritual master. But as one makes advancement in the process of devotional service, going from worshiping the deities and worshiping the spiritual master on the platform of Anartha Nivritti, and then entering into the stages of Nishta, of Ruchi, of Ashakti, Bhava, and Prema, that same thing, that same activity becomes a completely new experience. Worshiping the spiritual master, worshiping Tulsi Devi, worshiping the deities, all these activities develop deeper and deeper meaning as one hears the Srimad Bhagavatam, takes shelter of Lord Chaitanya, and develops an inclination to serve the Lord, similar to the personalities found in Srimad Bhagavatam. And this is the ultimate fruit of Srimad Bhagavatam. This is the gift that it's offering the world. And this is why Lord Chaitanya has put emphasis in his Pancha Anga Bhakti that one should hear Srimad Bhagavatam in the association of advanced devotees. Because through this process, one actually begins to understand what devotional service, Shuddha Bhakti, actually is. So I'll open it up for discussion, and if there's any questions, we'll speak about it.
Class. What's wrong with the English language anyway? What's wrong with the English language anyway? You seem to do a pretty good job of describing the philosophy using it.
It's something that Gaur Govinda Maharaj used to say a lot, that there's certain subtleties that exist within Sanskrit. Like for instance, like the word rasa. Bhaktisiddhanta translated as mellow, but he said there's actually no English direct translation for the word mellow. And then even like entering into like, I don't know the topic deeply, but I know I've heard from Indra Maharaj, Madhavananda Prabhu, that even in like the platform of prema, there's different subsections of prema that exist, and the words like mona, for like like a sulky mood of love, and the different dimensions of love of God. These words, trying to translate them into English, it really doesn't do them justice. So that's what it means. The English language is a very choppy language, and it lacks subtlety. And so to convey some of the subtler points that are being expressed, the emotion that's being expressed, it's very, very difficult to express in the English language.
As you mentioned, the English language, just from the material point of view, even just not to be prejudiced, but the Latin language, if you're going to write a poet, has many different meanings and subtleties that I can say, surpass the English language.
Like one example, when you hear like Bhagavad Gita, for instance, and you sing the Bhagavad Gita, like if you chant a chapter of Bhagavad Gita every day and you sing the verses out. The way the verses are constructed is sometimes verbs and nouns will be moved around for the purpose of poetry. There's rules for that in Sanskrit. Whereas in English, it's not really the case. You can't move things around like that for the purpose of poetry. Sanskrit, you can move those things around, and by moving those things around, they actually bring out a flavor, a feeling, emotions. Whereas English, you're not so much able to do that.
From that verse that you just quoted from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Nirmat Saranam Satam. So this Bhagavatam is meant for the Paramahansas. What would you say that giving the Bhagavatam to people who are not at that level yet, let's say the outside people, not even practitioners, but living out
Well, the Srimad Bhagavatam says, Apanasam Tatim Goram Yanama Vivishogrinan Sadyo Vimutya Muteta Yambabeti Swayambayam. That even if one hears the holy name of Krishna, one becomes freed from so many sinful reactions. So the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is the means and the end. You know, it's the sadhana and the sadhya. But in order for that sadhana to be applied properly, one needs to take shelter of Lord Chaitanya. And this is actually exemplified by Srila Prabhupada. In his own Bhagavatam, he gives this whole, prose description in a few paragraphs describing the importance of Lord Chaitanya. And then he gives a brief history of the life of Lord Chaitanya in his introduction. So even if one buys a Srimad Bhagavatam on the street, like a Srimad Bhagavatam 1.1, I remember after I read Science of Self-Realization, it talked about Srimad Bhagavatam so much, and I was like, I really want a Srimad Bhagavatam. And then I met a devotee in like Corvallis, Oregon on my way back from California. And I asked him, do you have a Srimad Bhagavatam? And he's like, you're never going to believe this. My wife, she said, why are you bringing that book? No one's gonna want that book today. And then I asked, do you have a Srimad Bhagavatam? And so, I became attracted to the Srimad Bhagavatam. But then by reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, one begins to understand the importance of Lord Chaitanya. And Lord Chaitanya is extremely attractive. I remember when I first was reading Science of Self-Realization, the incarnation of love of God that Prabhupada writes about Lord Chaitanya. I thought that was so beautiful. I thought Lord Chaitanya was so wonderful. So, taking shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam and taking shelter of Lord Chaitanya, they're not incongruent of each other. One will naturally come about. One just simply needs to hear about Lord Chaitanya. And by hearing about Lord Chaitanya, one will feel naturally inclined to want to take shelter of him. If their Agata Sukriti is accumulated to a point where they're able to make that conscious decision. Yes. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you for a wonderful class. I think an important aspect also of reading Srimad Bhagavatam is the purport that's been given by the pure devotees.
Yeah.
Parampara. And I think that's the real essence of us being able to distribute that book freely to every individual that we meet. Because that explanation by itself is enough for a person to become attracted to Bhagavatam. Otherwise, if we just had the translations, there'd be like mass confusion. I remember I looked at the Bhagavad Gita, not Prabhupada's, but another Bhagavad Gita, and I read it, and I really couldn't relate to it. I could understand. I thought that was beautiful to read about a war, but I didn't understand the inner meaning of that whole conversation or exchange. But then when you got the Bhagavad Gita of Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, immediately it opened up a whole different world. It opened your eyes to what the meaning, deep meaning of the particular Bhagavad Gita was about. So I think the purports are very essential.
Very amazing point. I was just actually reading yesterday in the Transcendental Diary that there was a certain society that came here before Srila Prabhupada that had a translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam, but no one did anything with it. Now we're seeing thousands and thousands of Bhagavatams that's being distributed around the world, and people being made just by reading the Bhagavatam. And it's because by taking shelter of Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, people are unconsciously taking shelter of the instructions of a pure devotee. That's a really important point. Thank you. Yes.
Also, on behalf of the English language, I think that, as I understand it, English was chosen as the computer language of the world because of its simplicity. And in this way, Srila Prabhupada also chose the English language to introduce the Vedic literatures to the world, and perhaps because of that simplicity, the world is able to understand it. If he had tried to present it in, let's say, the Vedic language, and kind of force people to learn Sanskrit, such as people must learn Latin, if you're in medicine or different scientific educations. So very few people would have come in contact with the deep meaning of the Vedas. But Prabhupada chose that the English language perhaps he did that for its simplicity. Mm-hmm. And its ability to permeate the world.
Well, the history of the English language is very fascinating because, and how it became the world language, because at one point, the sun never set on the British Empire, and so the English language spread because of the dominance of the English Empire, and then after World War II, the British were basically had been smashed by Germany, and America had become the world superpower at that point. And then that really set the stage for Srila Prabhupada to come to America. So it seems like it was Krishna's arrangement to make English the world language, and there was a whole plan set in place in order to, establish this spreading of the message of Srimad Bhagavatam through the English language. I'm not trying to, bash on the English language anyway, but it's an excellent point. Yeah.
So it's in the Parampara itself, that instruction was given to spread Krishna consciousness through the English language. Then the world
Yeah.
would accept it.
Prabhu, I get the impression all the time when I hear classes like the one you just gave, and compiling all the different point of views of the Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, and then bringing it to Prabhupada with all the program that we have, the worship Tulsi Devi, worshiping the deities, Harinam Sankirtan, distributing this knowledge. That is his goal. He wants everyone to go to, not just to the Vaikunthas, but actually beyond that, to Goloka Vrindavan.
Yeah.
Isn't it that?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, Prabhupada put Krishna in the center for a reason. He didn't put Lakshmi Narayan in the center. And it's because Prabhupada is the representative of Lord Chaitanya. And Lord Chaitanya's desire is to give people access to the realm of Vrindavan.
Haribo.
Hare Krishna.
Kaha Goranga, Vaja Goranga, Namare.
Hare Krishna. Thank you all very much. Vanchakalpatrumvascha kripa sindhuve evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Namashreshtha manum kasisha sachiputamata surupam shirupam tasagajamurepanirmati nindosvayatim radhakundam girivaram mahodari pamadavam sampatu yasya pratika kripaya shigurun tamasasu. Can I get a head rub? Thank you.
This is even in
Hare Krishna. Thank you. Thank you.